Hey everyone, I want to discuss cell types in this video. We had a lot of different cell types. We had a lot of tissue types, but then within the tissue types we had a lot of different cell types to learn for chapters 4, 5, and 6. So I'd like to just review some of those. So I'm going to skip over most of the epithelial tissues. We didn't talk about the names of the cell types there very often. But let's go to connective tissue and let's talk about what we'll find there. So remember we started in connective tissue with loose connective tissue, and then we moved on to dense connective tissues, like dense irregular, dense regular, dense regular elastic connective tissue, and also reticular tissue. All right, so the first cell type that we encountered was the fibroblast, and the fibroblast is we find we'll mostly see it in loose and dense connective tissue. When you do see pictures of it, when you have to identify it in class, you'll be looking at loose and dense connective tissues. And what does it do? It makes the extracellular matrix, especially the collagen. The fibroblasts can secrete extracellular matrix and make the collagen. Now, we also saw adipocytes. Do you remember where we saw those? In adipose tissue or fat tissue. And what's their purpose? They store lipids. Remember they had that big lipid inclusion? That big white center? They looked hollow, but they weren't really hollow. They had fat molecules in them, triglycerides. Alright, so we also had dendritic cells. And remember, this is different from the dendrites on a neuron. These are dendritic cells. They have processes that come out, and so that's how they get their name, dendritic cells. Where do we see them? In our class, we see them in reticular tissue, especially in lymph nodes and in the spleen. And what they do, they function as phagocytes for the immune system. They kind of stay there in I picture them as being perched on the reticular fibers, and they can reach out and grab pathogens. Pathogens being, that could be bacteria, that could be cancer cells that have metastasized, things that shouldn't be in our lymph or in our blood. All right. Next we moved on to cartilage, and we saw chondroblasts. And now the name is similar, fibroblast, chondroblast. And if you remember back to fibroblasts, those were mature cells that acted immature. So what does it mean that they act immature as cells? That means that they're making the extracellular matrix. Chondroblasts are truly immature. And so they're not mature cells pretending to be immature, they are actually immature cells. And we find them in cartilage. And what do? They build the cartilage extracellular matrix. So look, the blasts build extracellular matrix. Alright, so chondroblasts. Now, after they've built this extracellular matrix, they're not like moving around from place to place much. So they're pretty stationary. So they're building this extracellular matrix. They're building it all around themselves. And so what happens is they get closed in their extracellular matrix. It's a little cave they make for themselves. And that's called the lacunae. And the lacuna then kind of closes it off to the nutrients that it needs. And it no longer is very metabolically active. It doesn't have the nutrients it needs to be metabolically active. So so we find the chondrocytes. So once it's no longer metabolically active, we call it a chondrocyte. So it starts as a chondroblast, becomes a chondrocyte. The chondrocytes we then find in the lacunae that they made as chondroblasts. So chondroblasts make the lacunae, and chondrocytes are in the lacunae that they made back when they were chondroblasts. But they still have a couple jobs. Maintenance of extracellular matrix. So they get a little bit of nutrients, enough to make the to maintain the extracellular matrix. So if you make extracellular matrix, you're a blast, fibroblast, chondroblast. We'll talk about osteoblasts. So making extracellular matrix, it's a blast cell. Maintenance of extracellular matrix, it's a cyte, chondrocyte. Chondroblast makes the extracellular matrix. Maintaining the extracellular matrix, a chondrocyte. All right, let's move into bone. Osteoblast. So again, we have the word blast. So we have osteo meaning bone, blast, building. So these osteoblasts, we'll find them under the periosteum, under the endosteum. Basically, you need to know that they're in bone. And what do osteoblasts do? Blasts build bone. Osteoblasts build bone. Or, better said, bone deposition. Think of deposition like a deposit. When I put a deposit in the bank, I have more money in the bank, hopefully. When I put a deposit in my bones, I would have more calcium, more crystals. So they deposit the bone. And really, actually, they're depositing cartilage, and then the crystals follow. So bone deposition. Osteoblasts. Blasts build bone. Osteocytes. So the osteoblasts are building the bone, and again, they've closed themselves in a lacuna. And the osteocyte, they then become osteocytes. So osteoblasts build the lacunae around them, and they become an osteocyte once they're closed off from the nutrients. So osteocytes are living in the lacuna of the bone. And they still have a job. They maintain the bone, the maintenance of extracellular matrix. So similar to chondrocytes, osteocytes are doing maintenance of extracellular matrix. And osteoclasts, these are different. And they don't have a counterpart in cartilage. Osteoclast, we find them in the bone. They do resorption of the bone. They secrete those hydrogen ions and the enzymes, and that breaks down the bone. And they resorb the nutrients, the amino acids, the calcium, the phosphates, and the sugars. So that's osteoclast. If osteoblasts make a deposit, osteoclasts make a withdrawal. They're working against each other. Osteoblasts on one hand, osteoclasts on the other, and they're kind of, what we want to do is strike a balance between the two of them to keep our bones healthy. So osteoblast, osteocyte, osteoclast in bones. Now I'd like to go to the skin for a little bit and spend some time with epithelial. If you remember, we have keratinocytes, and these we find in the skin. These are stratified squamous cells, and they produce a tough protein coat called keratin. So that's why they're called keratinocytes. So remember, you can have stratified squamous non-keratinized, so you find that in the esophagus and in the vagina, but for keratinocytes, you find them on the skin and keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And what's the purpose of these keratinocytes? Well, what's the purpose of skin? It's a protective barrier, and it's a barrier to polar substances because of those tight junctions in the skin. They keep polar substances from getting through, and also remember the granules that are the lipids that are secreted by the granular layer. Those will keep polar substances from getting through or from getting out. It keeps us from dehydrating. And if you remember, skin has desmosomes. So the desmosomes protect against mechanical stress, and that keratin protein also helps with that. All right, and then finally, goes with the keratinocytes. It's kind of embedded in there with the keratinocytes. We have melanocytes. We find these in the skin, and melanocytes we find in the deeper layers of skin, down near the stratum basale, and they have arms that reach out. And remember from the picture in the textbook, the arms reach out and kind of even can pierce into the keratinocytes. And these protect our DNA from UV radiation damage. So they melanocytes insert melanin into the keratinocytes, and that melanin travels so that it's superficial to the nucleus of the keratinocytes in the stratum basale, and that protects those cells from the UV radiation. Now remember, because it has arms, it can also pierce through the basement membrane. So melanocytes are more likely to become metastatic than other types, than keratinocytes, for example. But keratinocytes, they can divide, especially in the lower layers, the stratum basale, stratum spineosum. So you do sometimes see some cancers there as well. All right, so these are cell types that we talk about in chapter 4, 4, 5, and 6, really. And it's good to know them for the exam. It's good to know them because they're fun. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.